Okay, we're online. I am just going to check if everything is working and if this is showing up the way that it should. Uh, so, okay, I see one viewer. I'm just checking that everything is working. I just went online. Sorry for the delay for the person on. I'm just having a bit of technical trouble at the moment. Okay, so I think that there's a bit of a glitch here. I'm going to stop this stream and restart and see if it all lines up the way it should. So go back to the channel and we'll see if we can get this working. Okay, I'm going to try this again. See if this all works properly. Having some kind of problem getting the stream to show up on the channel the way it should. So sorry for the delay. Okay, now this looks like it might be working properly. Hi there. Okay, so yeah, okay. Somehow this isn't lining up because I'm seeing that the oh, hello, there we go. Okay, maybe it is lining up now. One waiting. Okay. Okay, so it looks like for some reason this maybe didn't show up on the channel as the scheduled stream. I'm not sure why, but I see two of you have found it, so that's a good sign. I'm just going to check a setting or two, but I think we'll just get rolling in a second. Yeah, okay, so this looks right. Okay. Okay, well, I don't know that there's anything much I can do about that issue at the moment. I think we should just get started, and if there's anybody who has trouble finding it, I hope that they do find it. It connected when you posted the, okay, good, okay, there shouldn't be a problem then. All right, well, shall we begin with a prayer? In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in us the fire of your love. send forth your Spirit, and we shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who by the light of the Holy Spirit did instruct the hearts of the faithful, grant that by the same Spirit we may be made truly wise and ever enjoy his consolations. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay. So, tonight's subject is the successors of the apostles, and we're covering essentially the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So from the death of St. John the Apostle and the end of the apostolic age around 98 up to more or less 313 AD. We're not going to end right at 313, but we're going to set things up to resume with the year 313 and the very significant world historical events around those years to do with the Roman Empire. So we are going to launch into it. Okay, hold on 1 second. I see it now says 0 viewers, so I'm just going to refresh the chat. Okay. If anybody is still watching, please say something in the chat. If I don't see anything in the next minute or so, I'm going to assume that I've lost the viewers that were here. Still here? Okay. Still there? Okay. Okay. It's not telling me how many viewers there are. It did last time. I don't know what the issue is, but anyway, we'll just press on. I'm going to just assume everything's fine. Okay. So the successors of the apostles and the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So in the apostolic age, obviously the apostles were still around, right? And so they were the ultimate governors and teachers of the church. But with the death of St. John around the year 98, that age ended, and we entered the age of the bishops, right? The successors of the apostles. And there's some evidence that in apostolic times, the local churches, like the Church of Corinth that St. Paul writes to, for example, or the Church of Smyrna or Rome, what have you, if there wasn't an apostle actually there overseeing things, the local churches would be governed by a sort of college of bishops. But it seems clear that by at least around the year 100, those colleges of bishops were replaced by the individual bishop as head of the local church. And so something resembling, what we know today, one diocese, one bishop as head of that diocese had emerged. So I have a couple of quotations to illustrate this. They're from St. Ignatius of Antioch. St. Ignatius was a martyr and a bishop. He died around the year 110 AD in one of the early Roman persecutions, and he was a friend of St. John the Evangelist, the apostle, right? So he personally knew the last of the apostles. And Ignatius, when he was on his way to his martyrdom, he wrote a series of letters to different churches. So this is a quotation from a letter of his to the Smyrnians. He says, "You must all follow the lead of the bishop, as Jesus Christ followed that of the Father. Follow the presbytery as you would the apostles." So the presbytery meaning the sort of group of priests or elders of the church. Presbytery is where we get our word priest, or presbyter, rather. "Reverence the deacons as you would God's commandment. Let no one do anything touching the church apart from the bishop. Let that celebration of the Eucharist be considered valid, which is held under the bishop, or anyone to whom he has committed it. Where the bishop appears, there let the people be, just as where Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church. It is not permitted without authorization from the bishop either to baptize or to hold an agape, but whatever he approves is also pleasing to God. Thus everything you do will be proof against danger and valid." We have another quotation a little later expressing the same sentiment. This is from a writer named St. Cyprian of Carthage. And he says, "You should understand that the bishop is in the church and the church in the bishop, and that whoever is not with the bishop is not in the church." So we have here very, very early testimony to the emergence of the structure of the church that we recognize today. governed by hierarchy with the bishop as the head, bishop as head of the local church, with authority over sort of governance and discipline as well as over teaching. And so bishops are going to be significant characters in what we're going to see narrating the history of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So in preparing this topic, the main sources I've used out of my books are McSorley, An Outline History of the Church, Neil Schmont, History of the Catholic Church. This is one that I discovered a couple of weeks ago and just started reading for this one and found it to be just excellent, superb. I think at this point, if I were to recommend one volume History of the Church, it would be this one, Neil Schmont. And then Hughes' Popular History of the Catholic Church. And Hughes gives a little bit of an introduction to the historical evidence for the history of the church in this period. And it's a good way to set up the topics we're going to discuss tonight. So he says about our knowledge of the church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. There is a none too voluminous collection of polemical, apologetical, and expository writings that survive. Out of the Christian literature that's available, that still survives, this none too voluminous collection. The precious facts very often are no more than the carefully gleaned obiter dicta, that is, things said by the way or along the way, of the theologian and the controversialist, of the unbeliever and the heretic too, no less than of the Catholic writer. Now this is exactly what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at some of the writings of theologians, controversialists, and including the writings of some unbelievers who give us information about the situation and history of the church. Now Hughes goes on, he says, one great exception there is indeed to all this, the event recurring continually through the first 3 centuries, and in every part of the church, of the Catholic accepting death and torture rather than forsake his religion. It is the martyrs who are the leading personalities of this early Catholicism, and they abound, but again only a handful of the vast multitudes are known to us even so much as by name. So this gives us basically our sketch of the history we're going to cover tonight. We're going to cover theological controversies and a little bit about the way that they contributed to the development of Christian theology, Orthodox Christian theology, through refutation of heresy, and then also the Roman persecutions of the church and the martyrs. So just to get us back up to speed on where things stand, we're still looking at basically the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd century, and this is a map of its territory around the Mediterranean. And over the course of these centuries, the Christian church spread across that empire. So we got into some of this when we talked about the Apostolic Age. Spreading outward from the Holy Land, south into Egypt, north into what they called Asia Minor. It's today called Turkey. But all of this is an area of Greek culture, all along the eastern half of the Mediterranean. So into Greece, this area of North Africa, which is basically centered around the city of Carthage. And this was a Latin-speaking area. They had been integrated into Rome for a long time, to Roman culture, so they spoke Latin. And then Rome itself, the testimony of the New Testament suggests that Rome was the location of one of the earliest Christian communities outside the Holy Land, and then gradually spreading north into what the Romans called Gaul, what we call France, and into Britain and so forth. So we're not going to get all the way through into Ireland and Great Britain and so on. But this is basically the big picture of what's happening in these centuries with the spread of the faith. So, okay. As far as evidence goes, like you said, we have some pastoral and expository letters. like the Epistle of Clement. There's a work called the Didache, which is kind of a work of Christian moral teaching. Another work called the Shepherd of Hermas. But the most interesting and voluminous evidence, and what we're going to focus on, is the Apologists. And the Apologists are involved with the two subjects for today: heresies and their refutation, development of Catholic theology, and the Roman persecutions, and then their defeat by the martyrs. The Apologists were involved in both. Many of the Apologists met their end in the Roman persecutions. Okay, so first of all, heresies and the Apologists. And I'm going to quote occasionally from Neil Schmond or some other authors, so I've got the book right here in front of me. Now, Schmond introduces this subject with a very helpful statement about the nature of Christian doctrine. So he says, Christianity consists of a body of revealed truths announced by Christ to the apostles and handed on intact to the faithful. Although the deposit of faith was completed by the time of the death of the last apostle, St. John, around 100 AD, the explanation, interpretation, and elaboration of its truths has been a continuous process. So, for example, primitive symbols of the faith, primitive just meaning old, like toward the beginning of the time of the church, not meaning anything disparaging. So primitive symbols of the faith, such as the Apostles' Creed, expressed but did not explain fundamental doctrines. Many Christians misunderstood or rejected part of the church's teaching. Finally, the absence of a recognized terminology to express theological concepts in Greek or Latin created difficulties. From such sources arose error, heresy, and the corruption of Christian doctrines by Christians themselves from either moral or intellectual causes. Heresy, therefore, was a catalyst contributing to the elucidation of the truth. For the champions of orthodoxy had to combat error with carefully reasoned explanations of traditional doctrine. So this, it's connects with what came up at the end of the last lecture with development of doctrine, right? The creed that we profess today is still the Apostles' Creed, right? As Neil and Schmond pointed out, the Apostles' Creed expresses the Christian faith, but it does not explain all of its fundamentals or interpretation or application. And so the way that doctrine tends to develop is people attempt to explain some article of this creed, like, in what way is Jesus also God, if we believe in one God, or in what way was the salvation of men accomplished on the cross, or what have you. People attempt an explanation of it, or an interpretation, and that either is basically accepted and approved by the church, or the church sort of stands ambivalent and allows it to be employed without neither endorsing nor rejecting it, or it is resisted and rejected and possibly condemned by the church. And so through this process, doctrine develops, and we end up with where we are today, where you can have a book like The Sources of Catholic Dogma, this big, containing magisterial teaching on doctrine. And yet, again, we still profess the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed is still a summary of the faith, right? The content of the faith has not been increased. So there were a number of these attempted interpretations of the Christian faith, or attempts to join the Christian faith with some philosophical system or other kind of religious system in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And it gave rise to a number of significant developments in Catholic doctrine, essentially the first Christian theology or theological literature in response to these developments. So there are a number of kinds of these what end up being declared heretical doctrines. The first and the most persistent is Gnosticism, and you've probably heard of it. The earliest actual episode recorded of Gnosticism would seem to be the magician Simon Magus in Acts of the Apostles. St. Peter encounters this magician who's got this big following, and he converts him to the Christian faith. But the magician goes on with his sort of syncretistic occultist outlook, and is famous for attempting to buy the conferral of the Holy Ghost in the sacrament of holy orders, and then is condemned by Peter for it. And this is where the word simony comes from, the buying of church offices. So Simon Magus is an early example of Gnosticism. And Gnosticism arose out of the sort of religious ferment in the Greek-speaking half of the Roman Empire. It's syncretistic. It's a kind of like it has some similarities to the idea that exists today that's sometimes called the nameless religion, but the sort of spiritual but not religious outlook, connected with things like The Secret or The Power of Positive Thinking, or New Age type stuff, where people often don't reject all or abandon all of that when they profess a different religion. They just sort of merge it with Christianity or Judaism or whatever it is. So Gnosticism was like that. And there are a number of characteristic doctrines of Gnosticism, but one of them was that salvation is accomplished through initiation into secret knowledge, and usually initiation through secret, mysterious rites. So because the Christians under periods of persecution sometimes practice their rites in secret, again, there's a certain similarity there. The Gnostics, I'm not going to get too much into their beliefs. It's a big category. There are a lot of different kinds of Gnostics, but the Gnostics produced a great output of pseudo-Christian literature in the early centuries, and the most famous of these are apocryphal Gospels and epistles and Acts. And so there are Gospels that were eventually rejected by the church that were produced by the Gnostics, and basically like retell the story of the life of our Lord or what have you in a way that fits in with Gnostic beliefs. So I'm not going to linger over Gnosticism. I'm going to keep going. And by the way, again, I can't actually see the number of people that are watching. So if you are watching, it would reassure me a bit if you could just say something, so that I can see that there are people in the chat and I don't need to like restart the stream or anything. Okay, so the next of the major heresies is a heresy of a man named Marcion. Marcion is famous for rejecting the Old Testament. And I'm going to quote Hughes on Marcion. So Marcion, well, okay, here's how he introduces it. He says, if the Gnostics often put us in mind of the modernists of the last generation, it is Luther whom Marcion recalls. For Marcion, the son of a bishop, born about the year 110, and by the way, I think instead of saying the foul insult son of a bee, I think we should say son of a bishop, because it has a bad connotation anyway. So the son of a bishop left the church to organize outside it a return to what he considered the gospel's primitive purity. Again, parallel to Luther, right? For Marcion, there were two gods, the lesser of whom was the creator of the visible world. It is this god, Demiurge, who, jealous of his own creature, man, expelled him from paradise and thereby began the history of human sin and misery with which the Old Testament record is filled. The Jews were this God's chosen people, according to Marcion. Salvation is from the good God, who sent Jesus Christ to save men from the bond of Demiurge, and who was himself really God, but man in appearance only. For matter is essentially evil, and so he could not take a body that was a reality. There is then a fundamental opposition in Marcion's scheme between the Old Testament and the New. And Marcion is very anti-Jewish, right? He considers the God of the Old Testament to be an evil God, basically, whereas the God of the New Testament, Jesus Christ, he considers the good God. So Marcion's great hero is St. Paul, the greatest of all the disciples of Jesus Christ, and he takes St. Paul's writings as the great guide. Unfortunately, according to Marcion, they have suffered much at the hands of the Judeophile Christians who persecuted St. Paul alive and dead. Much of St. Paul's writings, as they had come down to the church, Marcion therefore refused to accept, and applying as a test his own notions and theological theories, he brought out a revised version of St. Paul, and indeed of the whole New Testament, from which he cut away whatever did not square with his system. Marcion had a genius for organization. He made many disciples, and following the model of the church, organized them into churches throughout the Roman world, and provided them with a ritual and moral code of impossible rigor, based on the notion, which he shared with the Gnostics, that all matter is evil and that the disciple must liberate himself from servitude to matter, that is, from the use of matter as far as possible. So you can see a number of parallels with Luther in the person of Marcion, particularly making his own theological notions the test of what is valid in the New Testament, right? The scriptures themselves being subjected to his own internal standard. Now continuing on, there's two more heresies or quasi-heresies I'll mention. And the most interesting thing from my point of view about these is the way that they set up for the apologists, because the Christian apologists arise in response to these heresies. So the heresy called Montanism, basically the idea there is that people who have the charism of prophecy as a gift of the Holy Ghost and personal inspiration are to be listened to as the guide to Christian teaching and life, as opposed to the teaching authority of the church. And so this was condemned by a pope named Zephyrinus. Again, you can see a certain relevance, to the history of the church over the centuries. The most tragic episode in connection with Montanism is that the great Christian apologist Tertullian ended up as a Montanist and joined their sect. Now last, there's an interesting case. It's not heresy, but sort of, under the same rubric from these centuries. Neil and Schmont comment on the fact that there was a certain tendency toward moral rigorism in the church in these centuries, in the second and third. So he says, in both Montanism and Marcionism are to be seen also a leaning toward moral rigorism characteristic of early Christianity, orthodox and heretical. And so he cites as examples excessive respect for virginity, prohibition of the use of meat and wine, severe fasts, an inclination to deny the possibility of forgiveness of sins committed after baptism, especially fornication, murder, and idolatry, and so on. So he says, the church frowned upon this moral rigorism, but was slow to speak its mind. So many of the great Orthodox Christian writers of the time, if you compare them to the whole tradition of the church, over the last 2,000 years, appear to be sort of erring on the side of moral rigorism. And to me, there's a useful lesson here, basically, which is that it's to drive home the distinction between the teaching of the church and common theological opinion, or the common run of opinion within the church, right? So there were many common theological opinions at the time that were very morally rigoristic and have been abandoned or even sort of, I don't know if I would say condemned exactly, but certainly ejected from the teaching of the church. But they were not part of that magisterial teaching. They were just common opinions. So, for example, the tendency to deny the possibility of forgiveness of sins after baptism. Often people would concede that people had one opportunity after a severe sin post-baptism to be reconciled to the church, and there was a long, severe penitential practice connected with that. Pope St. Calixtus in the early 3rd century mitigated the severe penitential discipline, And it immediately provoked controversy from some of the great writers in the church, including Tertullian and St. Hippolytus, right? So he was resisted for a sort of appearance of laxism in mitigating the church's penitential discipline. But again, this seems to be, he's moving things in the direction that the church would eventually endorse, and our modern practice of the availability of confession for post-baptismal mortal sin, clearly has moved a long way from the firm moral rigorism of the time. But anyway, again, to me, it drives home this distinction between actual teaching of the church and common theological opinion. There was a good article on this subject recently. He called it Official Theology, and I think it's by Thomas Pink. I think that's the author. Anyway, I'll post a link to it in the notes after, if I find it. Okay, so all these heresies gave rise to a Christian response in the form of the Apologists. And in the first place, indisputably, is an apologist named St. Irenaeus of Lyon. He was a disciple of St. Polycarp. I'm going to talk about Polycarp again a little later. And Polycarp was a disciple of the Apostle John. So he's sort of 2 steps from the Apostle John. And Irenaeus became Bishop of Lyon in France in the year 177. And he wrote a work against the heresies, which was originally written in Greek, survives only in a Latin translation, and it's the first outstanding work of Catholic theology. And the great thing that Irenaeus does is he doesn't just condemn the heresies, but he gives a positive exposition of Catholic doctrine. And he established the central role of tradition and of the teaching of the Church of Rome in establishing the orthodoxy or error or heterodoxy of a teaching. So I'm going to quote from Irenaeus of Lyon. Irenaeus writes, "It is within the power of all, therefore, in every church, who may wish to see the truth, to contemplate clearly the tradition of the apostles manifested throughout the whole world. We do put to confusion all those who, in whatever manner, assemble in unauthorized meetings, by indicating that tradition derived from the apostles, of the very great, the very ancient, and universally known church, founded and organized at Rome by the 2 most glorious apostles, Peter and Paul, as also by pointing out the faith preached to men, which comes down to our time by means of the succession of the bishops. For it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church," that is the Roman Church, "on account of its preeminent authority, that is, the faithful everywhere, inasmuch as the apostolical tradition has been preserved continuously by those who exist everywhere." So he says our criterion, if we need to test whether something is part of the faith or not, is what does the Church of Rome teach, and then what do all the bishops that are in communion with Rome teach, and with special attention to all those churches whose lineage goes back directly to the apostles. Now he goes on to name all of the bishops of Rome that there have been up to his time. So he names Linus, Anacletus, Clement, Evaristus, Alexander, Sixtus, Telesphorus, Hyginus, Pius, Anicetus, Soter, and then Eleutherius does now, in the 12th place from the apostles, hold the inheritance of the episcopate. In this order and by this succession, the ecclesiastical tradition from the apostles and the preaching of the truth have come down to us. And this is most abundant proof that there is one and the same vivifying faith, which has been preserved in the church from the apostles until now and handed down in truth. Right, so this is his central principle of determining whether something is orthodoxy or heresy. And it's Irenaeus who sort of first set that out explicitly. And it's essentially the exact same principle that is applied in testing, for heresy or orthodoxy to this day. So Irenaeus, in the first place among the apologists. There are some other interesting episodes connected with these early controversies. there was a conflict between two apostolic traditions over when to celebrate Easter. There was an Eastern tradition in the churches of Asia, which is the name they gave to the churches of Turkey, and Rome. Rome celebrated Easter on the Sunday following the 14th day of Nisan, Jewish month, and those in the East celebrated it on the 14th day after Nisan, whatever day of the week it was. So these were incompatible traditions. And there's another lesson to be learned with how this all played out. So Pope Victor insisted upon those in Asia following the Roman tradition. And when they refused, he excommunicated the churches of Asia, like as a group. The Eusebius, who records it, says that he excommunicated the churches of Asia. And he was criticized by a number of the Western bishops for being excessively severe and unjust on this point, and eventually he lifted the excommunication. Somehow this ended up being resolved in favor of the Roman tradition, but it's not clear how. But there's another lesson here, which is that the individual acts of command or precept, even of popes, are not infallible, right? The overall government of the church, I'm not going to try to do justice to an exact formulation of it, but at the overall level, there is a protection of the Holy Ghost given to the government of the church, as well as to its teaching authority. But at the level of individual commands, by a pope to a particular person, or even excommunications, is not infallible. And so there is room for error here, and room for correction, and so on. There's another interesting episode connected with Trinitarian heresies, centered on Saint Hippolytus. So Saint Hippolytus lived in Rome around 200 AD under Pope Zephyrinus. He wrote some apologetical works exposing the heresies of others, but he himself fell into Christological heresies. And he was one of these moral rigorists, and so he ended up leaving the church with a group of adherents and was elected pope by his group of followers. And so he's the first anti-pope in history, Saint Hippolytus. But you'll note that his name begins with saint, right? So under a Roman persecution in the year 235, both he and the true Pope Pontian were exiled to the mines by the emperor, and in the mines they apparently were reconciled, and he died a martyr and is a saint, right? So it's a happy ending to that episode with Saint Hippolytus. Three other names I'm going to mention, but I can't go through them in too much detail. Tertullian, Saint Cyprian of Carthage, and Origen. So Tertullian lived around 200 AD. He was a Latin-speaking person. He was raised in Roman culture. He was actually a lawyer and converted to the Christian faith. And he wrote an apology aimed particularly at Roman hypocrisy in their treatment of the Christians. So we're going to see how that played out in a few minutes when we get there. He also wrote some apologetical works against heretics using the same principle as Irenaeus. But because he wrote in Latin, he contributed some of the basic terms of Latin theological vocabulary, like consubstantial, nature, person. Person comes from the Latin word persona, and it had to be applied to theology by someone, and Tertullian was the person who did it. Like I said, Tertullian ended up being seduced by the heresy of Montanism. Saint Cyprian of Carthage, around 258, debated with Pope Cornelius about the validity of baptisms administered by heretics. Now he himself, again, he's a saint, he was martyred under the Romans, but he adhered to the opinion that baptisms administered by heretics and holy orders administered by those who had apostatized under threat of torture or death were invalid. And so in response to his arguments, the theory that would eventually triumph, the Roman theory, was formulated, which is summed up in the words ex opere operato, by the operation of the act itself, basically. So the sacrament, by the very act of doing it, confers grace and is valid, and it doesn't depend on the character of the minister. This is going to come up again with Donatism, which we'll deal with in a subsequent week. And then finally, Origen. Actually, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, they're both part of a school that developed in Alexandria in Egypt. It's called the Catechetical School at Alexandria. So Alexandria is famous for its great library of Greek literature at this time, and it was essentially the intellectual capital of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. And in Alexandria, there were many converts made to the Christian faith who, because of their highly cultivated education, needed a more sophisticated instruction and presentation of the meaning of the faith. And so there developed this school of catechetics in Alexandria. And 2 of the leaders of it made great contributions to Catholic theology in these centuries. Clement of Alexandria essentially formulated the current Catholic view of the relation of philosophy to theology. He viewed philosophy as the handmaid of theology. And so things like, Greek philosophical learning can be used for the purposes of theology, purposes of understanding and explaining, as its handmaid. And there's actually a great verse from the Book of Wisdom that uses the word handmaid that comes to be cited in connection with this. So that's basically the Church's ideal of Catholic education to this day, right? Philosophy as the handmaid of theology, or learning, secular learning, as the handmaid of theology. If you conceive of theology as sort of knowledge of divine things, knowledge of God and of the ultimate end of man. And then finally, Origen, again, 3rd century. So Neil and Schmont, they say, until St. Augustine, the Church could boast no theological genius greater than Origen. Hughes goes even farther. Hughes says that Origen may be the most brilliant mind that the Church has ever had, but despite his brilliance, he fell into great errors on a number of points, and so he's not considered a sort of safe, reliable theologian on all points. But a genius, extremely learned in basically all fields, and in particular a brilliant exegete of Scripture and a brilliant textual scholar. So he wrote, according to St. Jerome, he wrote 2,000 books, attempted a systematic analysis of Christian belief, wrote great extensive works of scriptural exegesis. He did make a number of serious mistakes, basically caused by his adherence to Neoplatonism in philosophy, but his errors were condemned long after his death. So he died Orthodox in communion with the Church, and he was tortured to death under the Emperor Decius, and so he's counted among the martyrs. That was in 258. So, okay, that's a really quick bullet point summary of the Apologists, and this brings us to the persecution by the Romans. So, and let me get back here. Yeah. So I'll give you a quick summary of the situation of the Church in the Roman Empire and the way that the persecutions played out in these centuries. Now, the Roman Empire. Here, let me get this map up for a moment. If you look at the territory of the Roman Empire, it includes many different nations and cultures, right? You have Romans who have their pantheon of gods. You have Celtic Gauls who have Druids and their own, religion, pagan religion. You have Greeks with their pantheon. And you have a variety of groups from the Middle East, but most importantly, the Jews, who are monotheists. And then you have the Egyptian people who worship gods like Isis and Horus and so on. So the way that the Romans dealt with this was general tolerance for the traditional religions of the nations that they had conquered. So it's a common feature of empires throughout history, really. You in order to keep the peace and keep subjects from rebelling and causing trouble, you allow them to keep as much of their culture as you can tolerate, right? And so the Romans had a term, religiones licitae, means legally recognized religions or permitted religions. So the traditional religions of each of these people were counted as legal religions. And the Jewish religion was also a legal religion most of the time. There were occasional persecutions of the Jewish religion, but most of the time it was considered a legal religion. The Romans actually admired the antiquity of the Jewish religion and the splendor of the temple in Jerusalem. And you know, the first temple, which was built by King Solomon around maybe about 990 or 950 BC, the first temple was built before there even was a city of Rome, right? So again, the Romans respected the antiquity of the Jewish religion. But when the first emperor took power, and there was this sort of transition from the old Roman Republic to the empire, the emperor instituted what's called the imperial cult. And so the first emperor was Augustus Caesar, and he had the Senate deify Julius Caesar, who had been assassinated by the senators after he'd been declared dictator for life. So Julius Caesar was deified, and acts of worship to Julius Caesar were prescribed, and eventually, within a few emperors, this was prescribed for worship of the genius or the sort of guardian spirit of the living emperor was prescribed at certain sort of civic occasions for all citizens of the empire. So all citizens were required to at least offer, as an act of worship, incense or a sacrifice to a statue of the emperor. Now, there's a very interesting text from the New Testament in connection with this. So it's from Matthew chapter 16. You're familiar with this text. I read it last week, I think. But so I'll just read the beginning. Now Jesus, having come into the district of Caesarea Philippi, began to ask his disciples, saying, "Who do men say the Son of Man is?" But they said, "Some say John the Baptist, and others Elias, and others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Okay, so first of all, we have Peter's confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." And so that in itself is already setting Christ up as a kind of rival to the emperor, right? But the other thing is, at the very beginning it says, "having come into the district of Caesarea Philippi." Now, Caesarea Philippi, it's named after Caesar. It's a town named after the emperor. And historical research and archaeology show that there was a temple to Caesar in the town of Caesarea Philippi. So there was a temple with a statue in this temple where Roman citizens would be required to offer, or members of the Roman Empire even, not even necessarily full citizens, would be required to offer worship to the emperor. And so it's at this place that that Peter makes his confession, "Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now I find that just an interesting element in the story, because it foreshadows the rivalry of Jesus Christ and the emperors. So Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor, right? They were known for this. The Jews also generally refused to sacrifice to the emperor. There was some persecution occasionally of the Jews for this. There's a famous story of Caligula summoning some Jews to speak to him about this and threatening them. But in general, the Jews were basically recognized as a nation with their own particular religious scruples, and they were permitted to have an exemption from this once this was sorted out. But as soon as the Christians became distinguished from the Jews, and when the Christian faith was preached outside of the Holy Land to non-Jews, to Gentiles, they lost that protection of this national peculiarity. And so the Christians would refuse to sacrifice to the emperor, and this was a crime. This was considered treason against the state, and so they could be punished and put to death for this. So this is sort of the beginning of things. Now, there's another element to this that I think is important to highlight. So Neil and Schmont, they say that it was not only from the state that oppression emanated. Much of it also arose from the common people because of bigotry or prejudice. So he says, popular opinion definitely condemned Christianity. To some extent, this arose from ignorance and the bigotry which ignorance engendered. So there was secrecy around some of the Christian rituals. People suspected them for that reason, and they imagined things like cannibalism for the Eucharist and so on. Another charge hurled at them was hatred of the human race. And this is where it gets interesting. Neil and Schmont say, probably in reference to a certain aloofness from society evident among them. Some converts, expecting the imminent second coming of Christ, did turn their back completely on the world. But for most, it was merely that so much of the environment of Roman society was repugnant to Christian principles. Now, doesn't this start to sound a little bit like the situation we live in? Right? The Christians disliked for and suspected for their aloofness from society. And that aloofness is because much of the environment of Roman society was repugnant to Christian principles. Incidental and perfunctory acts of homage to the gods pervaded the daily life of the Roman world. Popular entertainments, especially the theater and gladiatorial exhibitions, presupposed low moral standards. To avoid contact with what they repudiated, the Christians often found it necessary to avoid social intercourse altogether. The imagination of the ignorant easily interpreted such conduct as misanthropy. Sometimes changes in established habits of the people as a result of conversion provoked ill feeling, as between a convert and his spouse or other members of the family. It's another thing some of us are familiar with. But the difficulty of Christians in freely taking part in social intercourse, to me, this strikes a chord with the situation today. So, okay. The earliest persecution was under the Emperor Nero. I talked about it last time because that's the persecution where St. Paul and Peter met their deaths. We don't need to talk about it again. The basic narrative of that is given by a Roman historian named Tacitus, who records the horrific sufferings that Christian martyrs were subjected to. But after Nero, there are basically three periods in the Roman persecution, three phases in the state's policy towards Christians. So the first period lasts until around 100 AD, to the Emperor Trajan. And in this period, the laws on the books mandating the imperial cult are just enforced. And so Christians are sometimes punished for not sacrificing. But there's no specific law against the Christian faith. It's just, the existing laws are enforced. And so one of these under the Emperor Domitian is the time when St. John the Apostle suffered. We don't know a lot about it, but he was exiled to the island of Patmos, which is where he wrote his Apocalypse, right? The next period begins with the Emperor Trajan around 100 AD. And it lasts until more or less the end of the 2nd century, around 200. So this is the period that historians know as the age of the 5 good emperors. It's the Pax Romana, it's basically the golden age of the Roman Empire. But ironically, the 5 best emperors from the point of view of the state were particularly bad persecutors compared to the previous century. Now, this era and the policy of the state toward the Christians is recorded in an exchange of letters between a Roman provincial governor named Pliny and the Emperor Trajan. So we have Pliny's letter to the emperor and then the emperor's reply. And I'm going to read you some of it because it sets things out very clearly. So Pliny writes to Trajan. Again, this is around 100 AD. I always turn to you, my lord, when in doubt. I've never had anything to do with a trial of Christians, and don't know what charges are made against them, or how they are investigated, and what degree of bother to go through in the effort. I am more than a little uncertain about whether to treat them all the same or to make concessions to the young and the aged among them. Are they to be pardoned if they express contrition? If a man used to be a Christian but has since ceased to be one, is he to be free of punishment? If one is a Christian but has otherwise committed no offense, should he be charged with a crime? Or do we prosecute only those Christians who commit additional offenses? In dealing with the Christians who have been brought before me, I have done as follows. So this is the procedure that Pliny followed before consulting Trajan. First, I questioned them as to whether or not they were Christians. Those who acknowledged it, I then questioned a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted in their ways, I had executed. Whatever the nature of their beliefs, I decided they deserved punishment simply for being so stubborn and obstinate. There were some among them who were Roman citizens, and I signed orders for them to be transferred to Rome. Accusations against others then spread, as so often happens, and several things followed. An anonymous affidavit was published that listed the names of many people who were believed to be Christians. Those who denied that they were or had ever been Christians, I put to the test. I had them invoke the Roman gods, offer prayer and incense and wine to your image, and curse Christ. It is said that no true Christian can be forced to do any one of these things, and so those who passed the test I ordered to be released. Others named by the anonymous tipster swore oaths that they were Christians, but then they denied it, saying that they used to be Christians but had long since ceased to be. These too all worshipped your image, sacrificed to the statues of the gods, and cursed Christ. Now he goes on to talk about what they told him about the Christian faith, about how they would meet on a fixed day before dawn, sing a hymn to Christ. They would swear not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, or bear false witness. They would share meals together. And he finds out from torturing 2 slave women, whom the Christians called deaconesses, what he describes as a disgusting and gross superstition, which is very probably his reaction to whatever description he got of the Eucharist, right? That's when I stopped my investigation and hurried to consult you, Trajan. The matter strikes me as warranting this appeal because of the number of people involved. There are many lives at stake of every age and rank of both sexes. This superstition is spreading like a contagion and is now to be found not only in the cities but also in villages and on farms. Nevertheless, it is possible to stop and cure it. He goes on to talk about reviving old Roman paganism. Trajan responded to Pliny with a brief letter of his own. You did well, Pliny, in sifting through the cases of the people charged with being Christians. It is not possible to lay down a single rule to serve as a fixed guide. Christians should not be sought out, but if any are accused and brought before you, and if you find them guilty, they should be punished. There is one exception to this rule. Anyone who denies being a Christian and proves it by worshipping our gods should be granted amnesty, even if he was under suspicion in the past. Anonymous public accusations should have no place in our justice, for it would establish a dangerous precedent to accept such accusations, and it would be against the spirit of our age. So this is Pliny and Trajan's reply. And so at this point, the policy of the state has changed. Christianity itself is now a crime, right? And if accused, those accused will be tried. If convicted, they will be punished with death unless they renounce their belief, in which case they will be set free. And torture was often used to attempt to persuade people to renounce the faith and curse Christ, as he describes there. So this was enforced with some consistency over the course of the 2nd century. Now, Christian apologists confronted the Romans about the injustice and hypocrisy of the way they were proceeding. St. Justin, the apologist, who was a Greek teacher of philosophy, wrote apologies both to pagans and Jews. And in some of his pagan apologies, he criticized the Romans for their procedure here. Tertullian was another. But so during the course of the 2nd century, there were a number of martyrs whose names we know. Pope Clement, St. Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Pope Hyginus, Pope Pius I, a whole bunch of martyrs of Lyon in France, St. Justin the Apologist, and St. Cecilia, patroness of music in Rome. And Neil and Schmont have another word I'll quote about this. They say, "In the face of the aggressive hostility of paganism, the Christians maintained an attitude of patient resignation. Not once did they attempt to strike back by rebellion. So the Christians calmly and often eagerly accepted injustice from the state as the surest means of gaining salvation. And this demeanor in turn helped recruit converts more rapidly than the executioners could deplete the ranks of the faithful." So that's the second period. Now there's another document, I won't quote from it extensively, but another document from this period that's quite famous, which is the martyrdom of Polycarp. So it's from around Polycarp was bishop of Smyrna in Turkey. He was a disciple of St. John the Apostle. He was martyred around 160 AD, and the Christian community there wrote an account of his martyrdom. It's a very, very early document recording the acts of a martyr. And it's a great, beautiful read. It's only about 20 pages. But that records a Roman official being tipped off to Polycarp being a Christian. He confronts him. He asks him to offer sacrifice to the Lord Caesar. Polycarp refuses, and records their sort of back and forth conversation. Caesar is reluctant to put him to death because he's such an old man. He's in his 80s or 90s, I think. And Caesar a second time says, "Swear by the genius of Caesar." And Polycarp says, "If you vainly suppose that I will swear by the genius of Caesar, as you say, and pretend that you are ignorant who I am, listen plainly. I am a Christian, and if you wish to learn the doctrine of Christianity, fix a day and listen." And he goes on standing firm and is put to death by the Romans. They debate throwing him to wild animals in the arena. They settle on burning him, and the account says that he wouldn't burn, and so they end up stabbing him to death. And the Christians then they burn him afterwards, and the Christians then collect his bones in order to venerate them. Okay, so that's the 2nd century. The third period lasts from about 200 to the Emperor Diocletian in the year 304. So 3rd century, basically. This time the state actually takes an active initiative in finding and rooting out Christians. So what happens is emperors will occasionally publish edicts against the Christians. And when there's an edict in force, a plan of campaign is applied, and you get a general persecution and literal pursuit of Christians. And so because these only last as long as there's an edict in force, they're sporadic. They're far worse, more systematic, more violent than the earlier ones, but they're sporadic. Between the edicts, there's an interval of peace. Occasionally, emperors will even give some protection to the church. So I'll just run through a few points on these. The Emperor Septimius Severus in 201 issued an edict forbidding conversions to Christianity. This is when Saints Felicity and Perpetua, converts to the Christian faith, and married women, mothers, were put to death. The Emperor Maximin issued an edict against bishops and pursued them. Anyone known to be a Christian bishop will be exiled or put to death. This is when Pope Pontian and St. Hippolytus were put to death. The Emperor Decius issued the first empire-wide persecution against everyone suspected of being Christians. And this was a real attempt to exterminate the Christian faith. The Emperor Valerian issued an edict against bishops. He issued an edict forbidding Christians to gather in assemblies. He confiscated the cemeteries where they buried their dead and sometimes met for worship. And then finally issued an edict against Christians generally. And it's under the Emperor Valerian that the Roman deacon St. Lawrence was executed. St. Lawrence, famous for two things. First of all, the story is Valerian summoned him, and he knew that the deacons were in charge of stewarding the goods of the church. And so he said, "Bring me all the wealth of the Roman church." And St. Lawrence gathered up all the poor Christians that the church cared for, the widows and orphans and so on, and brought them to the emperor and said, "Here is the wealth of the Roman church." And then the second thing he's famous for is having been put to death by being roasted on a gridiron, essentially on a barbecue. And while they were cooking him, at one point he said, "I'm done on this side, you can turn me over." And fittingly, he is patron saint of cooks, right? So St. Lawrence under the Emperor Valerian. Valerian was captured in battle with the Persians and put to death in a very brutal way, fitting revenge for St. Lawrence. And his edict was revoked by the next emperor, and there were about 40 years of peace before the final and worst persecution under the Emperor Diocletian in 303 and 304 AD. So Diocletian, he's one of the most famous of the later Roman emperors. He initiated a number of reforms to the Roman government that gave it a new lease on life for another couple of centuries. The most important of these is he divided the empire into 4 districts with an emperor governing each district. It's called the Tetrarchy. So each emperor was responsible for dealing with the Christians in his area, and so the severity of the edict during the time of Diocletian varied with the local emperor. It was worst in the eastern half of the empire, the Greek-speaking half, where the church was far older. And there was relative peace for the Christians in the northwestern quadrant, Spain, France, and England, which was ruled by an emperor named Constantius Chlorus, whose father of the next emperor, Constantine. We're going to come back to Constantine next week. But under Diocletian, there were 4 general edicts attempting to exterminate the Christian church in the eastern half of the empire. There were thousands of deaths, great destruction of Christian books and records. The records of the Bishop of Rome, apparently, the archive was destroyed, which meant, it's part of the reason why our evidence for the early centuries of the bishops of Rome is so spotty. This happens in history, right? If the records are lost, nothing you can do. You can't reconstruct the knowledge. You can't extrapolate back the way you could with like motion of planets in astronomy or something. So under that persecution, there were more martyrs whose names we know. I'll just mention St. Agnes and St. Marcellinus. So this brings me to where I want to conclude. I've been narrating these martyrs from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. And many of these martyrs, they gave an amazing witness to the faith, right? They went to their deaths, even when offered their freedom if they would offer sacrifice to the emperor and curse Christ, and they refused and went to their deaths. And Tertullian said the blood of martyrs is a seed, right? And so we see, even with these attempts to exterminate the faith, the church spreads through every generation, right? The seed that the martyrs plant spreads. So these martyrs have been commemorated by the church in her liturgy to this day in the Roman canon. Now you may be familiar with it, but it's the central part of the prayers of the Mass in the Latin Rite. It's the prayers before, during, and after the consecration of the Eucharist. And so if you look at those prayers, now I have it in my beautiful Treasure and Tradition Guide to the Latin Mass. If you look at those prayers, in the prayers before the consecration, there's a series of names listed. And so I'll just read this quickly. It's the prayer that begins, Nobis quoque peccatoribus, which you hear at the Latin Mass. And to us sinners also, thy servants, hoping in the multitude of thy mercies, vouchsafe to grant some part and fellowship with thy holy apostles and martyrs, with John, Stephen, Matthias, Barnabas, Ignatius, Alexander, Marcellinus, Peter, Felicitas, Perpetua, Agatha, Lucy, Agnes, Cecilia, Anastasia, and with all thy saints, into whose company admit us, we beseech thee, not considering our merits, but pardoning our offenses, through Christ our Lord. So, I have a listing of apostles and then martyrs here, right? We heard the names Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, Alexander was a pope, Marcellinus was a priest, Felicity and Perpetua were married women, Agatha, Lucy, Agnes, and Cecilia were virgins, Anastasia was a widow. And then in the other prayer, Sorry, I did these backwards. That was actually the prayer after consecration. This is the prayer before. Prayer that begins communicantes. In communion with and venerating the memory in the first place of the glorious ever Virgin Mary, Mother of our God and Lord Jesus Christ, also of thy blessed apostles and martyrs, Peter and Paul, Andrew, James, John, Thomas, James, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Simon and Thaddeus, Linus, Cletus, Clement, Sixtus, these are all popes who were martyred, Cornelius, Cyprian, Lawrence the deacon, Chrysogonus, John and Paul, Cosmas and Damian. Those were two physician twin brothers who were executed during the persecutions, and of all thy saints, by whose merits and prayers grant that we may be defended in all things by the help of thy protection, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. So this set of prayers, the Roman canon, was gradually formulated, going back all the way to apostolic times, but you can see that it was formulated in the 3rd and 4th centuries, reached its final form by about the year 600, and then has only had very tiny alterations since about 600. But again, the names of many of these martyrs who witnessed to the faith, to the Romans, and to whom much credit must be given for the spread of the faith in the Roman Empire, these martyrs have been commemorated in the liturgy in the Roman canon ever since then. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up there, wrap up the lecture, and take questions. We're going to resume next time. I think it's scheduled for 2 weeks from today. We're going to resume where we left off with the Emperor Diocletian and Constantine. And we're going to see the change in the situation of the church between the years 306 and 313. So I'm going to look at the questions now. I'm looking forward to taking questions. It's always enjoyable. Okay. When did the church start being called Catholic? In the martyrdom of Polycarp, there is a word. Hold on, let me get the text. I've got it right here. 1 second. Okay, I'll have to open the actual file and check on it. The PDF. I don't have it in those pages I printed, but there's a place in the martyrdom of Polycarp where the word Catholic is used. And there's a footnote in the edition of the text that I have that says, it's unclear if this is meant in the sense, in the sense that we use it today. But if it is, then it's one of the oldest uses of the word Catholic that survives, that we have. So that would be around the year 160, the use of the word Catholic. I believe that there are some of the 2nd century apologists later who use it, possibly St. Irenaeus of Lyon. I would have to look it up to be sure. Yeah, I think St. Irenaeus of Lyon uses the word Catholic. I can check on that. If not during the lecture, then after. But the word Catholic means universal. And so I think that in the earliest way that it's used, it's by contrast with the local church. So like, in St. Paul's letters, you have the Church of Corinth, Church of Rome, right? The church is named in St. John's Apocalypse. It's like the church of this place, church of the city. But if you want to speak about the whole church, then the word Catholic or the universal church could be used to distinguish from just the local church. I think that's the earliest way that it's used. But yeah, for a definite answer, I would have to look it up to give you a proper answer. Was the birth of Christ Christmas celebrated during this time? Now that's a good question. Was the birth of Christ Christmas celebrated during this time? I'm going to say I don't know on that one. My guess is no, but I don't know. So I'm going to have to look into that one. yeah, I have some ideas about where I could find information on that, but I don't know. Why did the Romans hate the Christians so much? Well, there are a few reasons that I quoted from Neil and Schmond at the beginning. First of all, there was just ignorance, and you know, so the Christians would often conduct their worship clandestinely, right, or discreetly. So they would do it discreetly and not like openly before the public. And there was a whole sort of what's called the discipline of the secret practiced at the time, and so some of the key doctrines of the faith were not spoken about openly. They were spoken among people who'd been initiated into the church. Now, I don't know a lot about the reasons for this or how exactly it worked, but in that situation, people outside were ignorant of what really went on, and so into ignorance you can project, what your imagination creates. And I know that there was certainly misunderstanding about the Eucharist. So there's actually an example I can quote you. So the Eucharist, Christians, it's the sacrament of the body and blood of the Lord, right? And so if you say the sacrament of the body and blood of the Lord in a context in which people know nothing about your religion, the pedestrian meaning of the words would suggest that you're eating someone's body and blood, right? And so the Romans often accused the Christians of practicing cannibalistic rituals or practicing human sacrifice, right? Like we sacrifice someone and then consume his body and blood. And I think, again, this may be what Pliny was referencing when he talked about the gross and disgusting superstition that a couple of the deaconesses told him about under torture. So, for example, there is, it's here. There's a Roman writer, and I have a quotation from him in Neil and Schmond. It's Minucius Felix, Roman writer, wrote a work called the Octavius, and he talks about Christianity. And he says, they know one another by secret marks and insignia, so, the secrecy of the religion. Everywhere also there is mingled among them a certain religion of lust, and they call one another promiscuously brother and sister. I hear that they adore the head of an ass, the basest of creatures, consecrated by a know not what silly persuasion. Certainly suspicion is applicable to secret and nocturnal rites, and those who explain their ceremonies by reference to a man punished by extreme suffering for his wickedness, and to the deadly wood of the cross, they take fitting altars for reprobate and wicked men, that they may worship what they deserve. And then he tells this story that he says is very detestable, well-known story about how novices are initiated. He says, it's graphic, but he says an infant is covered over with like meal, with like some kind of food. An infant is covered over with it, placed before the novice, and then the novice pierces it with like knives and then eats and drinks the blood. He says, with this consciousness of wickedness, they are covenanted to mutual silence. So, like, this is the kind of story that people would spread. You can see, again, even the whole, like, the use of meal, as in, like what do you call it, like flour or something, the use of flour and the drinking of blood. Like, there is some kind of rumor about the Eucharist going around that they are reacting to and sort of imagining what it might be. So there's that. There's the aloofness of the Christians that I described. They once someone converts to Christianity, he or she often will sort of separate himself from the social intercourse that he might have participated in before, because of how the whole of Roman society is filled with homage to pagan gods and lust and violence, cruelty in the gladiator games, and so on. So there's all of that, and then from the point of view of the state and the pagan Romans in general, the Christians are regarded as atheists. It's a common charge against Christians that they're atheists because they practice a religion that they say is incompatible with any of the other religions and that no other gods may be worshipped. Now, the Jews, again, even though there's a similarity there, the Romans viewed Judaism as like a national thing. It's limited to the Jews. So basically, that's just their idiosyncrasy. We'll leave them alone. But Christianity was a religion that was not limited to one nation. It was spreading through the empire and being preached all over the place. And it demanded of its followers rejection of all the gods that were known and accepted and worshipped, and the abandonment of all other religions. So again, like to the Romans, this was essentially atheism and a very dangerous thing because if you believe that the well-being of the state depends on having the favor of the gods that your ancestors have always worshipped, then the spreading of this religion is likely to bring ruin upon the state, right? It's like the way that, according to traditional Christian teaching, there are sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance. One of them is willful murder, another is oppressing the poor. In that way, the Romans viewed like atheism or abandoning the worship of the traditional gods, that it's going to bring down the wrath of the gods. So Romans, this is partly why St. Augustine ends up writing his book, The City of God, because there were Romans who blamed the Christians for the imminent fall of the Roman Empire, saying basically, you've lost us the favor of the gods that used to protect us. So, I mean, those are some of the reasons that are sort of commonly given by Catholic authors. I don't really have any special insight beyond that. That seems sufficient. And I certainly think that in our day and age, we can identify with the situation of Christians, right? Because, I mean, I think it's a common experience among believing, practicing Christians to encounter a certain hostility or dislike or resentment in our culture, particularly due to the way that Christians will distance themselves from things that other people partake in. Okay, I see some more questions coming up. Is persecution preferable for the church? I actually think basically yes. I mean, I don't want to be tortured to death. And the thing is, okay, let me put it this way. Just speaking from my own point of view, right? Just speaking for myself. Persecution successfully endured would probably be preferable to the status quo that we live in today. But it's by no means certain that I would successfully endure persecution, right? It's quite possible. I mean, I don't know. Like, I don't intend to, if I'm subjected to torture. I don't intend to renounce Christ. I intend to never renounce Christ. But who knows? If I were threatened with death, or if my family were threatened or something, who knows what I would do if I would break. So the thing is, it may be that in our time, with the people that we are, a non-persecution situation is preferable in the sense that more souls will be saved that way, right? Like, let's say, just hypothetically, I have a better chance of my soul being saved by living out a life of 70 years and having confession available to me and receiving the Eucharist every week, if not more frequently, and what have you. Let's say, hypothetically, that's the situation in which I'm best able to save my soul. So in my case, or in the case of others like me, persecution would not be preferable, right? But sort of at the general level, just speaking simply, I think basically persecution is actually preferable. From the point of view of, again, persecution successfully endured. Persecution successfully endured does seem to be good for the church. And I mean, what can I say about this? There seem to be a number of cases in history when a situation of terrible persecution was ended, and the church was in a relatively strong position from the point of view of the faith of the Catholic, of the members, right? There was a very strong faith that remained or increased during the time of persecution. And when the persecution was lifted and a more favorable regime was instituted, the faith deteriorated. This seems to have happened multiple times. So the two examples that I often think of are French Canada and Ireland. The Irish under English rule endured maybe the most persistent, dedicated attempt to eradicate the Catholic faith in a population ever. And there were very cruel, systematic measures undertaken over the course of centuries. And we can talk about this when we get to that time period. But the English rulers of Ireland for centuries attempted to separate the Irish from their faith, let's say. And Ireland, by the time of its independence around 1900, and freedom wasn't given to Catholics until a little while before that. Like, it wasn't that long before that these sort of punitive measures against Catholics were lifted. But Ireland became independent in the early 20th century, and at the time, Ireland was an amazing bastion of the faith. Ireland kept the faith through the Protestant Reformation, and all the way up to around the year 1900. There were these great sort of missionary priests sent out from Ireland. There was this great staunchness of the faith in Ireland. And then in the last 70 years, it seems to have, or maybe even more shorter time, maybe even like 50 years, the faith seems to have like started to disappear like smoke in Ireland. Now, I don't know that much about the Irish situation today. I'm just speaking loosely, but certainly the caliber of sort of witness to the faith and fidelity to the faith coming out of Ireland in the last 50 years does not seem to be the same as it was before. So you have, this lengthy period of persecution seems to have been relatively good for the church, and then a position of favor has not been good. And French Canada is a similar case, right? The French were not persecuted the way that the Irish were, but the French Canadian Catholics were certainly second-class citizens in Canada in a lot of ways under British rule, even though they were given. It's a complicated story. I don't want to do an injustice to the British. They actually were relatively generous to the French Canadians compared to some other situations. But the point is that the French were not in a situation nearly as favorable. The French church was not in as favorable a position. Okay, give me a second here. I need to rephrase what I started to say. French Canadian culture was in a second-class position for a long time, and that changed greatly in the middle of the 20th century. And the position of the French within Canada became of greater stature in the 20th century, let's just say. Again, I don't want to do an injustice. I don't want to oversimplify these things. But the church in French Canada 100 years ago would seem to be in a much better shape than it is today. I can't really do justice to the whole situation. But basically, at the bottom line, I think persecution at its simplest is preferable to the favor of the state in a situation where the state is not Catholic. That's the big caveat to be had here. There is a different way of looking at it when we're talking about a Catholic society with a state that is actively trying to cooperate with the church, right? Like in sort of the best times in the Middle Ages. That's another story entirely. But if we're talking about a state that does not profess the Catholic faith, a non-Catholic state, the question is persecution preferable to sort of favor and generosity? I think persecution is actually preferable. That's what history tends to suggest. Seems like Christianity began as a peasant or lower class religion. Well, if you look at the apostles, it looks that way, right? Fishermen, net makers, it looks that way. There's a lot of debate about whether within the Roman Empire Christianity was a lower class religion or an upper class religion. Again, there's a lot of debate about that. There's contradictory evidence points both ways. I really don't know the answer, but there's some suggestion that you might have a point. Yeah. Was the sacrifice of the Mass called so at the time? I don't believe it was called the Mass. So two halves of that, right? Sacrifice and Mass. I know something about where the term Mass comes from. When it comes to sacrifice, I don't know the answer. I don't know if it was called the sacrifice at the time. The word Mass is a later term, though, and it's a Latin term, and it's used in the Latin Church, but it's not used in it's not used in the Byzantine rites. It's called divine liturgy, right? Somebody can correct me if they want to. But the word Mass actually comes from the Latin word for dismissal. Okay. Think about Latin Mass, right? Most of us go there every Sunday. At the end of the Mass, the priest says, "Ite missa est," right? "Ite missa est." And the translation, like if you look in your red Mass book, or if you look in a book like this, the translation, I believe, is "Go, the Mass is finished." Let me just see what it says in here. Ite missa est. Okay, so in this one, it translates it, "Go, you are dismissed," which is a more accurate translation to the original meaning, the etymological meaning of the Latin word. And there's even a literal translation here. This is a great book, by the way. So I'll show it to you. I don't know if you can see it. "Ite missa est," and it says, "Go, the dismissal it is." So it goes back a very, very long way in the Latin liturgy. But the oldest text that I know of that I've actually encountered that discusses this is called the Itineraria Egeriae. It's an account of a pilgrimage made by a woman named Egeria to Jerusalem around the year 400, I think. So she travels from Western Europe to Jerusalem, and she writes up a kind of journal of her pilgrimage. And she talks about the liturgy in Jerusalem. And when she describes the liturgy, she always says at the end, "Missa est." And the way you translate it is something like "the dismissal is made." So the missa, it's from the verb mitto mittere, which means to send. So like a missive is something sent. A missile is a projectile sent, right? So missa means sending or dismissal. So the phrase "missa est" originally, etymologically, meant essentially the dismissal is made, or you are dismissed, right? So "ite missa est" means "go, you are dismissed." That phrase, "ite missa est," came to be essentially sort of retranslated or re-understood to mean "go, the Mass is accomplished." Missa est, if you were saying, if missa meant a thing called a Mass, missa est would mean the Mass has been done, the Mass has been accomplished. Originally means the dismissal, comes to mean "go, the Mass is ended," or "the Mass is accomplished." And this is where the phrase, the word Mass comes from. So Mass, it's not a word that's intrinsic to the whole Christian liturgical tradition. Like I said, the Eastern Church uses the term divine liturgy, which just means divine work. Liturgy just means work. These are just different ways of describing what you're doing, right? Like the Mass, it's a name given to the act of worship, kind of shorthand. As far as sacrifice, again, I don't know the answer to whether it was described as a sacrifice at the time. And if I can, I'll look into it and see what I can come up with. Okay, we're at an hour, an hour and a half. We started 5 minutes late, so we're at an hour and a half. I'm gonna call it a night there. Thanks very much for your participation. It's been great having you, and until next time, I wish you grace and truth. God be with you.